Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Revolutionary War Rarities, Season 3, the podcast from the Sons of the American Revolution. My name is Jim Griffith, and we have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Matt Bowdish. Matt,
Correct.
Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me on the show.
We appreciate you being here. Today's episode is entitled The Medical History of George Washington, and you're going to hear some noises maybe throughout this episode. We're actually shooting this from the lobby of the Galt House Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky. So you may see people walking behind us as well. That's okay. Doesn't matter. We're going to get the message across. So
we got some football games going on in the back. It's very exciting.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Matt, you brought this subject up to me a while back. I think it's an exciting subject. I think it's something that a lot of people don't know about, the medical history of George Washington. Tell us about that. Tell us some of the family history as well as his.
So again, thanks for having me on the show. I think like most genealogists, I became interested in our, family history going back as far as we can go back in terms of the generations. One of the things I couldn't really research much on was my family health history, because after about 100 years, the medical records seem to die off pretty quickly. We don't have death certificates and everything. But what we did have is we do have famous people that died back then, so we can get an insight into some of our ancestors' health histories based upon people like George Washington. And so I started researching George Washington as part of a talk series for this, and came up with a number of interesting anecdotes about him.
Very good, very good. So let's talk about his family history. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about his mother, his father, his brother.
Yeah, so like most people of the day, his family health history was mixed. There were a number of people that died relatively young, in their 30s or 40s of various respiratory ailments. However, his parents actually did pretty well. So his father, Augustine, died at age 48 from some sort of, it was described as gout of the stomach. And that could be anything from a ruptured peptic ulcer, so a stomach ulcer. It could be a form of stomach cancer or pancreatic cancer. We really don't know. But he lived to be about 48. George's mother actually lived to be 81 and died of breast cancer at that time.
Which is almost excessive age based on that time frame, right?
Yeah, we're looking at a life expectancy of somewhere around 38 years of age in Virginia at that time.
Amazing. All right, so she made it a lot longer than anybody,
Absolutely.
Or than most people anyway.
Yeah, so he had some good genes going forward.
Sure. Okay. Brother.
Yeah, so Lawrence Washington was his brother, and George Washington modeled himself after Lawrence in many ways. So Lawrence started out as a military man. He served in the War of Jenkins' Ear against the Spanish in the 1740s down in the Caribbean. He built a reputation through his military service, coming back to Virginia. He ended up marrying very well. He married Anne Fairfax, and they inherited some land from her father in Belvoir.
Is Fairfax County named after her family?
It is
okay.
named after her family.
Very good.
And so he was able to acquire some land through that. He married well through that, and he ended up serving in the House of Burgesses. So it kind of sounds a little bit familiar for George Washington,
right.
too.
I was going to say, he served in the House of Burgesses at one point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But where Lawrence was blessed in many ways from opportunities and some of the opportunities that he created for himself, he also suffered from pulmonary tuberculosis. So he had some major health issues that basically complicated his life for the last few years of his life.
Now, tuberculosis, that's a communicable disease, is it not?
It is, yeah.
Is pulmonary tuberculosis communicable?
Pulmonary tuberculosis is communicable.
Okay.
So there are other forms of tuberculosis as well, and we even see tuberculosis still today. It's not very common in this country, but in other countries we definitely see it.
Okay. All right.
So it's a disease that's killed a lot of people over the years.
Yeah.
And Lawrence went to great extent trying to figure out how to treat his tuberculosis. He even at one point went to England to seek the advice of doctors there on how to treat his tuberculosis. And one of the options they gave him was to spend some time in the Caribbean. And he ended up going to Barbados in 1751. And who did he take along but his half-brother, George Washington, with him?
Right.
That's an interesting story in itself, because he was invited to stay with the family of Gedney Clark. Gedney Clark was actually the uncle-in-law of Lawrence Washington, so Anne Fairfax's uncle.
Okay.
And they stayed with that family, even though one of the family members actually was suffering from smallpox at that time.
Okay.
And so within 2 weeks, George Washington himself contracted smallpox.
Now, what was the recovery period for smallpox?
It really depended. I mean, smallpox has probably been the biggest killer of human beings in our history.
Did he come back? So he got it while he was in, or was exposed to it while he was in Barbados. Was he back in the colonies by the time he discovered he had it, or was he still down?
No, he was convalescing for over a month still in Barbados while he was there. So he was quite ill. He didn't really write anything at the time, and we don't know too much about it. But there were some comments that in some of the historical documents that he was actually essentially in bed for about a month.
Okay.
And he bore some of the scars of smallpox the rest of his life, too.
And it wasn't just smallpox that he suffered from as he was coming along or growing up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So by the age of 15, when he qualified as a surveyor in Northern Virginia, he had already had measles, he had had mumps, he suffered from bouts of dysentery, what was called the bloody flux. He had diphtheria, which was called black canker at the time. And so he was suffering from all of these diseases that our ancestors, came across in the days before antibiotics.
Did he suffer from any of those during the Revolution, or were those all pre-Revolution?
They were mainly before the Revolution that we know of.
Okay.
Because if you think about it, his health history during the Revolution was a matter of national security.
Right.
So we actually don't know a lot of information about his health during the Revolution.
Now, two things. We have the issue with his teeth that everybody knows about or thinks they know about the issue with his teeth. Talk to us about that.
The myth is that he had wooden teeth or wooden dentures, and that was never true.
Okay.
He came from a wealthy family. He had good dentists, and he had teeth that were either fashioned from whalebone, cow bone. He even had a set of teeth that was fashioned from hippopotamus ivory. And we have records from Mount Vernon that he had actually bought 9 human teeth from the enslaved people at Mount Vernon for a total of about 122 shillings at the time.
Wow.
So he had dentures made from the teeth of his enslaved people at Mount Vernon.
Now, so at this point, what age are we talking about? I mean,
well, he lost his first tooth by the age of 21.
Okay.
And by the time he became president, which was in his 50s, he only had 1 tooth left.
Now, was that because of just the dental practices of the day, the lack of dental hygiene, so to speak, or was that from some type of a disease that could have caused that?
He had very strong opinions. He felt that his teeth came out because of him cracking walnuts as a child.
I would think that
with
would,
his tooth.
I would think that might contribute to it.
So, but I don't think that's probably what happened.
Okay.
It may have contributed a little bit, but I think the poor dental hygiene had something to do with it as well.
So finally, let's talk about the picture. The picture that shows some of these health issues.
So we don't really, we have some descriptions of Washington during this time. We don't really have any photographs or any kind of other documentary evidence of his health history, but we do have portraits, and we all think about some of the famous portraits like Charles Wilson Peale and John Trumbull's painting of Washington. But these were akin to like Vogue magazine back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. These were airbrushed portraits of him.
Right.
They were meant to make him look very good. One of his fellow Masons in Arlington was a gentleman by the name of William J. Williams, and he painted him about 5 years before he passed away. And it really shows an amazing amount of health history for Washington. For example, you can actually see the pockmarks on his nose and on his cheeks from the 1750s. He carried those scars with him the rest of his life. He had a mole below his right, just in front of his right ear. Could have been a mole, could have been a basal cell carcinoma, but there was a growth that you could see there. He had a rather large scar on his left cheek. That was due to a surgical procedure that he had for an abscessed tooth at one point in his life. So big abscess in his teeth, it caused the cheek to adhere to the jaw. They had actually cut it open and drained the abscess that way. And you can sometimes see that scar in some of his paintings that were made at the time, but they're very subtle. And this one is not so subtle.
Sure.
This guy even painted sun damage on his forehead, some small little growths around his eyes, and even a 5 o'clock shadow.
Wow.
It was a pretty detailed painting.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us about the family history or medical history of George Washington?
I think it's important to understand George Washington's final days. I think that's a really important part of his story, not only for him personally, but also kind of as a lesson for us physicians as well. So George Washington finished up with his presidency, I think it was 1797, and he went back to Mount Vernon to sit under his own tree and be able to go back to farming. And on December 12th, 1799, which was a Thursday, he was out looking after his lands and basically got stuck in a big rainstorm. It was actually a cold, wintry day. There was sleet and hail and snow. And he finally made it back to the house and took an early dinner and basically went right to bed. He wasn't feeling well at the time. The next day, he was essentially convalescing at home. He had a sore throat. He had some vocal changes in his voice was getting hoarse, but no big deal. I mean, he had suffered through many illnesses before. On the next day at 2 o'clock in the morning, he awoke and he had major health issues going on. He had developed stridor, which is a sign of obstruction in the upper airway. It's basically wheezing when he's breathing in and breathing out. He had developed fevers and chills, and Martha knew something was wrong. Yeah. So she called for Tobias Lear, who was Washington's personal secretary at the time. He tended to Washington. He actually called for George Rawlings, who was the farm overseer. And George Rawlings came in early the next morning and bled a half a quart of Washington's blood. So this was the days of Galenic medicine, where we thought we had the four humors and we needed to purge the body of some of these inflammatory mediators. And one of the ways we did it was through venesection, bleeding. And that's one of the ways that they were trying to treat him. They were also applying blisters, which are special bandages meant to kind of draw out some of the noxious chemicals from different parts of his body. They gave him enemas. And still, when he wasn't feeling better, when he wasn't feeling better, Martha called for other help. So she called on James Craik, who was one of their neighbors, who also was former Surgeon General of the Army. We have a miniature portrait of him in our Louisville Museum here for the SAR. And James Craik came over, assessed the patient, decided that Washington needed more bloodletting. So he drained yet another quart of Washington's blood.
And in all, how much did they drain?
Well, they took out approximately 60% of his blood volume over the time.
60%?
60%.
Wow.
So a 90-kilogram man, he was about 6'3", about 210. He would have had about 6 quarts of blood. They took out 60% of that.
Wow. Amazing.
And not unsurprisingly, he wasn't doing well even with the bloodletting.
I'm sure.
He had what we think was acute epiglottitis. And acute epiglottitis is where you get basically the epiglottis, which is a little valve that goes over the top of your windpipe. It keeps you from inhaling the food that you swallow, right? So it fits over the windpipe. That became probably quite swollen, or it could have been a peritonsillar abscess or some sort of other airway obstruction. But he developed this swelling and he couldn't breathe, and then they were actually pulling out all of his blood at the same time. Wow. So he was in a tough spot.
Aren't we thankful for the advances in the medical practices over the years?
We are. One of those advances was actually presented to Washington at the time. There was a young physician who was called at that point Elisha Dick, who should also be known to history, who had recommended against Dr. Craik's advice that Washington receive a tracheostomy. So a small hole placed below the area of obstruction. That had been described in the French medical literature at the time, but it had never actually been done in the New World as of yet. And so the older doctors basically overruled Elisha Dick and felt like, well, George Washington's not going to be our guinea pig here.
So the actual procedure that could have potentially saved his life, he would have still been a very sick individual from all of the other medical practices that had been applied to him prior to that.
Absolutely, but he had a strong constitution and he was a survivor. He had made it through all those other diseases, and unfortunately he didn't get the chance to survive that illness.
Sure. Well, Dr. Matt Bowdish, we appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for telling us more about George Washington's family or his medical history. And I think it's interesting for us when you think about the advances of medicine over the years, not only medicine but medical practices over the years. Just what a significant difference it's made in our own society, and the fact that the science itself has dramatically advanced our own country significantly and saved so many countless lives over the years.
We still live in these controversial times. We obviously went through a worldwide pandemic. It killed a lot of people. But I still say that we are living in a golden age of medicine now.
Sure.
Compared with what our ancestors went through, we are very, very fortunate. To
even our own, even our own mothers and fathers.
Right.
Right. I mean,
Absolutely.
we've had so much advancement just in the last 75 years. Well, thank you again. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah,
thank you for exposing.
This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for exposing us and our listeners to a new story and a new angle.
Fabulous.
So it's very much appreciated. My friends, that is another Revolutionary War rarity. This has been the podcast from the Sons of the American Revolution. Please join us again in 2 weeks for another episode. And this has been a production of the National Society, Sons of the American Revolution. My name is Jim Griffith, and this is
Matthew Bowdish.
Thank you again. We'll see you soon.